Mountain Man's Christmas mail-order bride. Arrived with a hidden talent that saved him. That's what folks whispered on a frozen December morning when a quiet woman stepped off the stagecoach. And the mountain man who sent for her realized she barely spoke a word. But the moment she reached the high ridge, the wind stopped, the mule froze, and a single soft sound from her lips calmed the wild like a prayer carried on snow. No one in town knew the truth. No one knew why she kept her voice hidden. No one knew who was coming up that mountain after her. Because when a dangerous mining gang returned to seize the mountain man's land, lanterns blazing and tempers ready to burn, the woman he'd brought home for Christmas carried a gift powerful enough to stop bullets and break a hardened heart. But when the gang's furious leader recognized her, when the past roared back with fire and iron, what happens when the one thing she's afraid to use is the only thing that can save him? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The stagecoach rumbled to a stop on the snow-dusted street of Silver Creek, its wheels crunching against the frozen ground. James Holt stood back from the small gathering of townspeople, his weathered hands tucked into his coat pockets. The December wind whistled between the buildings, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke from nearby chimneys. When the door opened and Seraphina Wells emerged, James noticed how carefully she placed each foot on the steps. Her dark blue traveling dress was simple but neat, and though her movements were hesitant, they held a natural grace. Her eyes stayed lowered, scanning the ground as if mapping every stone and patch of ice. "Welcome to Silver Creek, miss," the stagecoach driver called out, already busy untying her trunk from the back. Seraphina gave the slightest nod in response, her gloved hands clasped tightly before her. The small crowd of onlookers shifted and murmured, exchanging glances at her silence. "Well, I never," Martha Whitaker whispered, none too quietly, to her friend. "Doesn't even say thank you? Must be simple in the head, poor thing." James frowned at the unkind words and stepped forward, touching the brim of his hat. "Miss Wells? I'm James Holt." Her eyes lifted to meet his briefly, clear brown eyes that held intelligence and something else he couldn't quite read, before dropping again. She gave another small nod. "Much obliged for meeting me," she said, so softly he had to lean closer to hear. Her voice, though barely above a whisper, had a musical quality that caught him by surprise. "We should get your supplies before heading up the mountain," James said, keeping his own voice gentle. "General store's right this way." He collected her trunk from the driver and carried it easily to the store's covered porch. Inside, old Mr. Peterson peered at them, over his spectacles, as James helped Seraphina select the essentials she'd need for mountain living: extra warm socks, sturdy boots, thick flannel, and basic provisions. Throughout their shopping, Seraphina communicated mostly through small gestures, a pointing finger, a shake or nod of her head. James found himself naturally falling into the rhythm of it, reading her preferences from the way she touched certain items or drew back from others. "Strange one, ain't she?" Mr. Peterson muttered when Seraphina stepped outside to adjust her shawl. "She's just quiet is all," James replied firmly. He paid for their purchases and joined Seraphina on the porch, where the late afternoon sun was already sinking behind the mountains. "Ready to head up?" he asked, securing their supplies to his pack horse. "It's about 2 hours' ride, and we'll want to make it before full dark." Seraphina nodded, watching as he helped arrange her trunk and parcels. James had brought both his steady mountain mule, Buck, and his pack horse, knowing they'd need both animals for the journey. He helped Seraphina mount Buck, noting how she settled naturally into the saddle despite her city clothes. The first mile out of town was easy going on the well-traveled road. As they began to climb, however, the path narrowed and grew treacherous with ice hidden under the fresh snow. James led them carefully, choosing each step with the experience of countless mountain journeys. The wind grew sharper as they climbed, and James glanced back often to check on his companion. Serafina sat straight-backed in the saddle, her face partially hidden by her woolen scarf. Every so often her eyes would dart to the steep drop-offs beside the trail, and her hands would tighten on the reins. "Buck's sure-footed," James assured her. "He's made this trip hundreds of times." She met his eyes briefly and nodded, but her tension was visible in the rigid set of her shoulders. James found himself wondering about the whispers in town. There was nothing simple about the awareness in her eyes or the careful way she carried herself. Her silence seemed more like choice than limitation. They were about halfway up when they reached Widow's Ridge, a particularly narrow stretch with a sharp drop-off on one side. The setting sun painted the snow in shades of pink and gold, but James barely noticed the beauty. His attention was fixed on Buck, who had begun to show signs of nervousness. The mule's ears flicked back and forth, and his steps grew increasingly hesitant. James recognized the danger signs. He'd seen animals spooked by the height and exposure of this stretch before. He reached for Buck's bridle, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy there, old friend. Easy now." But Buck continued to dance sideways, hooves scratching against ice-slicked rock. Serafina sat perfectly still in the saddle, but James could see the fear in her white-knuckled grip on the pommel. The mule took another stuttering step, and loose, rocks clattered down the steep slope beside them. James's heart pounded as he tried to calm the animal. If Buck panicked here, on this narrow ledge, he pushed the thought away, focusing on keeping his voice steady. "Come on now, Buck. You know this trail." The mule's eyes rolled white, his whole body trembling. And then, just as James was about to order Serafina to dismount, something extraordinary happened. A single, pure note rose above the wind's moan. It was neither particularly loud nor particularly complex, just one clear tone held steady and true. But its effect was immediate and astonishing. Buck froze in place, his ears swiveling toward the sound. The trembling in his muscles eased, and his breathing slowed. James watched in amazement as the mule's panic melted away like snow in sunshine. The note came from Serafina. She sat straight in the saddle, her eyes closed, releasing that somehow perfect sound. It seemed to fill the mountain air with peace, making even the bitter wind feel less hostile. When the note finally faded, Buck stood calmly, all signs of fear gone. James stared at Serafina, who opened her eyes slowly. A flush crept across her cheeks at his obvious amazement, and she ducked her head, hiding behind the fall of her dark hair. That was... James struggled to find the right words. "I've never seen anything like it." Serafina's hands twisted in her lap, and she didn't meet his eyes. But she gave a small nod, acknowledging what had happened without speaking of it. The rest of their journey passed without incident. Buck remained steady and calm, as if the memory of that perfect note still soothed him. The sun had nearly set by the time James's cabin came into view, its windows glowing with the warmth of the lamp he'd left burning. James dismounted first, then helped Serafina down from the saddle. She was stiff from the long ride, and her hands were cold even through her gloves. As he steadied her, their eyes met briefly in the gathering dusk, and James saw again that mixture of intelligence and something else. Wariness, perhaps, or secrets kept close. The lamp's light spilled across the snow as James opened his cabin door, illuminating their way forward. He couldn't stop thinking about that moment on the ridge, the pure, perfect note that had calmed a panicked mule when nothing else could. Looking at Serafina's quiet figure, he wondered what other mysteries this silent woman might hold. As he helped her across his threshold, James felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Whatever had brought her to these mountains, whatever caused her to hide behind silence, he knew with certainty that Serafina Wells was far more than the simple-minded woman the townspeople had judged her to be. The gift he'd witnessed spoke of something extraordinary, something almost divine in its power to bring peace. The lamp cast their shadows long across the cabin floor as James closed the door against the mountain. Night. Outside, the wind sang its own wild song, but it couldn't match the memory of that single, perfect note that had touched something deep in his soul. James pushed open the heavy wooden door, ushering Serafina into the warmth of his cabin. The single room glowed with welcoming lamplight, revealing simple but well-maintained furnishings, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron cook stove, rough-hewn shelves lined with provisions, and a neat bed in one corner. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its flames casting dancing shadows. He watched carefully as Serafina took in her surroundings, expecting perhaps disappointment at the humble accommodations. Instead, her shoulders relaxed visibly as she unwound her scarf. Her eyes moved methodically around the space, noting the swept floors and organized shelves with what appeared to be approval. "It ain't much," James said quietly, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "But it's warm and dry." Serafina turned to him and offered a small smile, shaking her head slightly as if to dismiss his concerns. She kept her coat on, but moved naturally toward the cook stove, her hands hovering near its warmth. "Reckon you're hungry after that long ride," James said. "I can fix us some supper. Got beans already soaked, and there's cornbread from this morning." She nodded, then gestured questioningly toward the shelves. "Bowls are up there," James indicated. "Spoons in that drawer below?" As he worked at the stove, warming the beans and slicing the cornbread, Serafina moved quietly around the cabin. She would pause occasionally, looking at him with raised eyebrows when unsure where to find something. James found himself warming to this silent communication. Her gestures were clear and purposeful, nothing like the confused movements of someone simple-minded. She set the table with careful precision, placing each item just so. When James brought the pot of beans to the table, she was already pouring water from his pump pitcher into 2 tin cups. "Much obliged," he said, settling into his chair. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before James ventured a gentle question. "Was the journey from back east very difficult?" Serafina paused, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Long way." Her words were soft but clear, with no hint of confusion or difficulty. "From Pennsylvania, wasn't it?" She nodded, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "Philadelphia. Must be quite a change coming to these mountains." Needed change. Her eyes met his briefly, then returned to her plate. James recognized the careful way she chose her words, not from any lack of understanding, but as if each one carried weight. Her manners were refined despite her sparse speech, her movements measured and graceful. After they finished eating, Serafina rose naturally to help with the cleaning up. She washed while James dried, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. When everything was put away, she gravitated toward the fireplace, settling onto the small rug before it and extending her hands toward the flames. James gathered some spare quilts and his extra blankets, then set about rigging up a privacy curtain in the corner opposite his own bed. He used rope strung between hooks he'd already installed in the walls, creating a modest sleeping area for his new bride. "It's not much privacy," he apologized, "but it'll do until I can build proper walls come spring." Serafina nodded, watching his work with those observant eyes. She seemed neither disturbed nor disappointed by the arrangement. "I need to fetch more firewood before it gets any later," James said, reaching for his coat. "Won't be but a minute." Outside, the night air bit sharp and clean. James stood for a moment in the darkness, looking up at the stars scattered across the mountain sky. The memory of that pure note Serafina had sung on Widow's Ridge echoed in his mind. In all his years in these mountains, he'd never encountered anything like it, the way Buck had calmed instantly, as if touched by something divine. He gathered an armload of split logs from the woodpile, his thoughts still dwelling on the mystery of his quiet bride. There was something about her that spoke of deep waters, not simple-mindedness as the townsfolk had assumed, but rather a purposeful silence, like she was holding something precious and fragile within herself. When he re-entered the cabin, he heard it, a soft humming, so quiet it was barely there. Serafina sat in the same spot by the fire, her eyes closed, producing a gentle melody that seemed to make the very air feel warmer. Though nowhere near as powerful as the note she'd sung on the ridge, the simple tune filled the cabin's silence with comfort. She stopped when she noticed him, ducking her head slightly. James stacked the wood carefully by the fireplace, not wanting to break the peaceful moment with too many words. Finally, he spoke softly. "We can talk more tomorrow about what we each expect, how we might make this work between us." Serafina nodded, rising gracefully from her spot by the fire. She gathered her nightclothes from her trunk and disappeared behind the curtain James had hung. He banked the fire for the night and prepared for sleep himself, conscious of the soft sounds of movement from behind the curtain. Soon, the cabin was dark, save for the gleam of embers in the fireplace. James lay in his bed, listening to the wind brush against the cabin walls and the occasional pop from the cooling stove. From across the room came the steady, gentle breathing of his new bride. Not yet asleep, but settling into rest. It was strange, he thought, how the cabin already felt different with another person in it. Not intrusive or uncomfortable, but as if some of its loneliness had eased. Whatever had brought Serafina Wells to answer his advertisement for a wife, whatever caused her to wrap herself in such careful silence, James sensed the beginnings of something that might, with patience and care, grow into trust. The wind sang softly around the eaves, and James felt himself drifting toward sleep, aware of the fragile new partnership taking root in his mountain home. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-laden branches with golden light. James woke to the familiar chill of a mountain morning, his breath visible in the cabin's cold air. He glanced toward the curtained corner where Serafina slept, hearing only quiet breathing. Moving silently, he pulled on his boots and heavy coat. Outside, frost crunched beneath his feet as he made his way to the woodpile. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. James positioned a log on the chopping block, his axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The familiar work warmed his muscles despite the cold. The cabin door creaked open, and Serafina emerged, wrapped in her thick shawl. She nodded a quiet greeting, then disappeared around back to the storage shed. James paused in his work, watching as she returned moments later with the flour sack and what looked like his coffee tin. By the time he finished splitting enough wood for the day, enticing smells wafted from the cabin's chimney. Inside, he found Serafina kneading biscuit dough with practiced movements. The cook stove radiated welcome heat, and coffee bubbled in the battered pot. "Smells mighty fine," James said, hanging his coat. Serafina's hands stilled briefly as she glanced up, offering a small smile. She gestured towards the coffee pot with a questioning tilt of her head. "Yes, please," he answered, warming his hands by the stove while she poured 2 cups. The biscuits turned out light and flaky, speaking to experience rather than luck. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional scrape of tin cups against the table. James noticed how Serafina's movements, though quiet, showed confidence in handling the everyday tasks of keeping house. "Got to check my trap lines today," he said, as they cleared the breakfast things. "Show you around some of the property too, if you're willing." Serafina nodded, already reaching for her coat and boots. James noticed how she stayed close as they stepped outside, her eyes scanning the vast wilderness spread before them. The mountain's immense silence seemed to make her uneasy, though she showed no sign of wanting to retreat indoors. Their first stop was the creek, its waters running swift and dark beneath a thin sheet of ice near the banks. James demonstrated how to break through the ice at the shallow edges to draw water, explaining how the creek rarely froze solid, even in the depths of winter. "Creek comes straight off the mountain," he said, filling their buckets. "Sweet and clean as any water you'll find." Serafina listened intently, her eyes following his movements as he explained which spots were safe to step on and which might hide treacherous ice. When it was her turn to fill a bucket, she copied his actions precisely. They carried the water back to the cabin, then prepared for the longer walk to check the trap lines. James saddled his horse, Thunder, while explaining his usual routine. The gelding, normally steady as a rock, shifted restlessly under the saddle. "Easy there, boy," James murmured, checking the cinch. But Thunder continued to dance sideways, tossing his head. Without prompting, Serafina stepped forward. A soft note emerged from her throat, barely louder than a whisper but pure as mountain spring water. Thunder's ears pricked forward, and his dancing feet stilled. The horse lowered his head, blowing out a gentle breath as Serafina's quiet song wrapped around him. James found himself struck again by the strange power of her voice. It wasn't just the volume or pitch. There was something in the tone itself that seemed to reach straight into troubled hearts and ease them. He'd never seen anything like it, not in all his years in these mountains. "That's quite a gift you have," he said softly when she finished. Serafina ducked her head, cheeks coloring slightly. "It helps," she whispered. "Sometimes." They spent the morning checking James's trap lines, finding 2 rabbits and resetting the empty traps. James demonstrated how to read the signs of animal passage in the snow, explaining which tracks belonged to deer, elk, or mountain lions. Serafina absorbed it all with quiet attention, staying within arm's reach as they moved through the forest. By midday, they'd worked their way back toward the cabin. While James took care of the rabbits, Serafina heated soup left from the previous evening. Over lunch, James found himself sharing stories of his early days in the mountains, learning to trap from old Samuel Weber, building the cabin, surviving his first winter alone. "What brought you out here?" Serafina asked suddenly, her voice soft but clear. James considered the question, stirring his soup. "Needed space to breathe, I reckon. Too many people back east, all pressed together. Out here," he gestured toward the window, where snow-covered peaks rose against the sky. "Out here, a man can hear himself think, find his own way to walk with the Lord." Serafina nodded as if she understood perfectly. "And you?" he asked gently. "What brought you all the way from Philadelphia?" Her eyes dropped to her bowl. "Needed a new start." James noticed how she offered no details, how her shoulders tensed slightly. Whatever lay in her past, it wasn't something she was ready to share. He changed the subject, telling her about the vegetable garden he hoped to expand come spring. The afternoon passed quickly with more practical lessons: how to bank the cook stove fire to last through the night, where to find emergency supplies if weather turned bad, which window shutters needed extra securing against mountain winds. Serafina proved an apt pupil, asking occasional questions through gesture or soft-spoken words. As evening approached, James sat at the table with paper and pencil, drafting a letter to the marriage agency clerk. He kept the words simple and direct, confirming Serafina's safe arrival and their intent to proceed with the marriage as arranged. From her spot by the fire, Serafina watched him write, her expression holding something like gratitude. After supper, James noticed her standing at the window, gazing down at the dark ridge below the cabin. Something in her posture spoke of wariness, as though she half expected to see something moving in the shadows. Whatever she'd left behind in Philadelphia, it clearly still weighed on her mind. But when she turned back to help him clear the supper dishes, her movements were steady and sure. They worked together in the lamplight, falling into an easy rhythm that felt natural despite their short acquaintance. The cabin's warmth wrapped around them like a quilt, and James realized that for the first time in years, the evening silence felt rich instead of empty. Looking at Serafina's quiet competence as she dried the last plate, James felt a spark of hope. Whatever had brought them together, her need for sanctuary, his for companionship, something genuine was beginning to grow in the space between them. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the foundation for it. Trust, respect, and the simple warmth of shared purpose. 2 days after their initial settling in, heavy clouds gathered over the mountain peaks, promising another December storm. James and Serafina worked steadily to haul firewood from the ridge before the weather turned. The morning air held that peculiar stillness that often preceded snow, making their breath visible in small, frosty clouds. "Best stack it high against the cabin wall," James instructed, adjusting the load in his arms. "Storm might last a few days, by the look of those clouds." Serafina nodded, her cheeks pink from exertion as she carefully arranged the split logs. She had proven herself surprisingly strong for her slight frame, matching James' load for load, though at a slower pace. Her methodical stacking would ensure the wood stayed dry, even if the snow drove sideways. They had made 3 trips already between the ridge and the cabin. On their 4th return journey, loaded down with arms full of wood, James heard voices carrying on the crisp mountain air. He paused, adjusting his grip on the logs. The sounds grew clearer, multiple men talking, boots crunching through patches of snow, the jingle of equipment. "Might want to wait here a moment," he said quietly to Serafina, who had also stopped walking. She drew closer to his side, her arms tightening around her bundle of wood. A group of men emerged from around the bend in the trail, 5 or 6 of them carrying surveying equipment and marking poles. Their heavy boots and thick wool coats marked them as mining crew, not ordinary travelers. At their head walked a broad-shouldered man, whose very presence seemed to command attention. The leader's face bore a prominent scar that ran across his jaw, partially hidden by several days' worth of dark beard. His eyes were sharp and calculating as they fixed on James, taking in the homestead below with obvious interest. Something in his severe expression made James instinctively step slightly in front of Serafina. "This your place?" the scarred man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. He didn't wait for confirmation before continuing. "Name's Garrick Wells. I represent the Silver Creek Mining Company." "James Holt," James replied evenly. "This is my land, yes." Wells gestured to his men, who had spread out slightly, examining the rocky outcroppings that lined the trail. "We've been surveying the area. Company geologists say there's a promising ore vein running through these ridges, likely crosses right under your property." "That so?" James kept his voice neutral, though he didn't like the way the miners were eyeing his land. "Well, Mr. Wells, I reckon what's under my ground is my business, same as what's on top of it." Wells's expression hardened slightly. "Company's prepared to make you a fair offer for the property. More than fair, considering it's just you up here." His gaze flicked briefly to Serafina, then back to James. "Lot of money for a man to consider." "I appreciate the offer," James said firmly, "but this land's not for sale, not to your company or anyone else." One of the miners spat into the snow. "Ain't natural. One man holding on to so much mountain when there's good ore going to waste." "That's enough, Cooper," Wells said sharply, though his eyes never left James's face. "Mr. Holt's entitled to his opinion. For now." He stepped closer, his bulk making the movement seem almost threatening. "But you might want to reconsider, Holt. Company's got plans for this area. Be a shame if things got difficult for you up here." James stood his ground, meeting Wells's stare. "I've weathered difficult before, Mr. Wells. This is my home, and I mean to keep it that way." A tense silence stretched between them. James was acutely aware of Serafina's presence behind him, and the way Wells's men had stopped their pretense of surveying to watch the confrontation. Finally, Wells stepped back with a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Think on it, Holt. We'll be back once you've had time to see reason." He turned to his crew. "Move out, boys. We've got more ground to cover before that storm hits." The miners gathered their equipment, several of them muttering under their breath as they fell in behind their foreman. James caught fragments of threats about stubborn fools and teaching lessons, but he kept his expression neutral until the group disappeared around the bend. Only then did he turn to check on Serafina. She stood perfectly still, her face pale despite the cold. A fine tremor ran through her body, causing the firewood in her arms to shift slightly. "You're shaking," he said softly. "Here, let me take that wood. We should get back to the cabin before the weather turns." Serafina relinquished her load without protest, but James noticed she kept glancing over her shoulder as they made their way down to the cabin. He attributed her nervousness to the miners' threatening behavior. It would unsettle anyone, especially someone new to mountain life. The wind picked up as they reached the cabin, driving the first few snowflakes before it. James quickly stacked the last of the firewood while Serafina disappeared inside. By the time he finished and went in to wash up, she had the stove going and soup heating for their midday meal. But something was different. The easy comfort they'd developed over the past 2 days had vanished. Serafina moved around the cabin like a shadow, her actions mechanical. When James set bread and soup before her, she barely touched either, stirring the broth listlessly with her spoon. "Something troubling you?" he asked gently, after watching her push the same piece of potato around her bowl 3 times. "Those miners gave you a fright, I expect. But they're just making noise, all talk and no substance." Serafina shook her head slightly, still not meeting his eyes. It's just the storm coming," she whispered. "Makes me uneasy sometimes." James knew it for a lie. She hadn't shown any distress during the previous storm. But he didn't press her. Whatever was bothering her, she clearly wasn't ready to share it. They finished their meal in silence, broken only by the increasing moan of wind around the cabin's corners. As James cleared the dishes, Serafina wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped outside onto the small porch. Through the window, he watched her stare down the mountain trail, her posture rigid with tension. The snow was falling steadily now, but she seemed oblivious to the cold. Her face, barely visible in profile, showed naked fear, an expression far too intense to be caused by mere weather or the empty threats of rough miners. James started to join her, to offer comfort or at least get her out of the cold, but something in her solitary vigil made him hesitate. Whatever demons she was watching for on that trail, this was a private moment. He turned back to the dishes, resolving to keep a closer eye on both Serafina and the mining crew in the days ahead. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-laden clouds in shades of pearl and rose. Inside the cabin, James stirred the banked coals in the stove, adding kindling to build the morning fire. He had woken to find Serafina already up, her bed neatly made behind the privacy curtain. She stood at the window now, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, staring out at the lightening sky. The fear that had gripped her yesterday still showed in the rigid line of her spine and the way her fingers twisted in the fabric of her shawl. She had barely slept. James had. Heard her tossing through the night, and dark shadows ringed her eyes. "Might do you good to talk about what's troubling you," he said quietly, keeping his tone gentle. "I know it's more than just the storm." Serafina's shoulders tensed at his words. For a long moment she remained silent, her breath fogging the cold window glass. When she finally turned to face him, her face was pale as the snow outside. She started, then stopped, pressing her lips together. Her hands trembled as she gripped the shawl tighter. "I haven't been entirely truthful with you, Mr. Holt." James pulled out a chair at the table, gesturing for her to sit. "Whatever it is, you can tell me. You're safe here." She sank into the chair, though her posture remained taut as a drawn bowstring. "The man yesterday, Garrick Wells." Her voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. "He's my brother." James felt his eyebrows rise in surprise, but he kept his expression calm, not wanting to startle her into silence. "Your brother?" he prompted softly when she didn't continue. Serafina nodded, her gaze fixed on her twisted fingers. "My older brother. He raised me after our parents died, but he—" Her voice caught. She drew a shaky breath before continuing. "He didn't approve of my singing, said it wasn't natural, the way animals and people would quiet when they heard it. He tried to make me stop, first with words, then—" She trailed off, but James could fill in the awful blanks. His hands clenched involuntarily at the thought of anyone trying to beat such a gift out of her. "That's why you barely speak above a whisper," he said, understanding dawning. "He tried to silence you completely." Serafina nodded again. 5 years ago, I couldn't bear it anymore. I ran away in the night. There was a flash flood while I was crossing a river. I lost my bundle, my shawl." Her voice grew distant with memory. "When I made it to the next town, I heard people talking about a woman's body found downstream. Everyone thought. They thought you had drowned," James finished quietly. "Garrick believed I was dead. If he discovers I'm alive—" Fear crept back into her voice. "He'll be furious. He always said I belonged with family, that no one else would understand, that I needed his protection from those who'd use my voice for their own gain." "You don't need his kind of protection," James said firmly. "What he did wasn't protection at all. It was control, plain and simple." Serafina's eyes filled with tears. "I know that now, but he's dangerous when he's angry, and he has all those men working for him. Listen to me." James leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "This is your home now, if you want it to be. I won't let him hurt you again. You have my word on that." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Why would you risk yourself for me? You barely know me." "I know enough," James said simply. "I know you're kind and hardworking. I know you have a gift that brings peace instead of harm. And I know no one deserves to live in fear of their own kin." Serafina wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. The morning light streaming through the window caught the tears on her cheeks, making them shine like crystal. "Thank you," she whispered. James stood, giving her a moment to compose herself. "The barn door needs mending before the next storm hits. Would you help me with it? Work has a way of settling the mind sometimes." She nodded gratefully, clearly relieved at the chance to do something practical. They bundled up against the cold and headed out to the barn. The door had worked loose from its top hinge, letting in drafts that made the horses restless. James showed Serafina how to hold the door steady while he realigned the hinge. They worked together quietly, the familiar motions of the task creating a peaceful rhythm. When he needed tools, she anticipated which ones to hand him, showing the same quiet competence she'd displayed with household tasks. The physical labor seemed to help ground her. Some of the haunted look left her eyes as they worked, replaced by simple concentration on the task at hand. By the time they finished, the door swung true again, and Serafina's shoulders had lost some of their tension. As they walked back to the cabin for the midday meal, James noticed her glancing at him sideways, as though trying to read his thoughts. He suspected she was still worried about how he viewed her after her revelation. They ate a simple lunch of bread and stew, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been at breakfast. As they cleaned up afterward, James finally spoke what had been on his mind. "I want you to know something," he said, carefully drying a bowl. "In this home, you never need to fear speaking or singing, as suits you. Your voice is a gift from the Almighty, not something to be ashamed of or hidden away." Serafina's hands stilled in the dishwater. "Even after knowing what trouble it might bring?" "Especially then," James said firmly. "Hiding your light doesn't stop trouble. It just lets darkness win." She considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time that day, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. As evening settled over the mountain, they sat in their usual places by the fire. James worked on mending a pair of work gloves, while Serafina darned socks. The familiar crackle of the fire filled the comfortable silence between them. Then, so soft at first it might have been the wind, a melody began to drift through the cabin. Serafina was humming an old hymn, her needle moving in time with the gentle tune. Her voice remained quiet, barely enough to affect anything, but the simple act of allowing herself to make music in his presence spoke volumes about growing trust. James kept his eyes on his work, not wanting to make her self-conscious, but a warm smile spread across his face. He recognized the hymn. Amazing Grace, and its message of redemption from fear seemed particularly fitting. In the firelight, he could see Serafina's shoulders gradually relaxing as she continued to hum, growing slightly more confident when no criticism came. The sweet notes of her voice wove through the evening air like golden thread, transforming the simple cabin into something approaching sanctuary. James felt his admiration for her growing. Despite everything she had endured, her spirit remained unbroken. She had found the courage not only to flee her brother's tyranny, but to begin building a new life. And now, even knowing Garrick was nearby, she was finding the strength to reclaim her voice. As the last notes of the hymn faded away, the peaceful atmosphere remained. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin something new had taken root, a deeper understanding between them and the first fragile blooms of healing. The December morning dawned crisp and clear as James and Serafina prepared for the journey into town. James had hitched the wagon before sunrise, loading it with pelts to trade and making sure the brake was solid for the steep descent. Serafina emerged from the cabin wearing her best dress, a simple brown wool with a touch of lace at the collar, and James couldn't help but notice how it brought out the warm highlights in her hair. Ready? He asked, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. She nodded, gripping his hand firmly as she climbed aboard. The touch lingered a moment longer than necessary, speaking of trust earned over their days together. James settled beside her, clicked his tongue at the horses, and they started down the mountain trail. The descent took time, requiring careful navigation of the switchbacks. Serafina held tight to the seat rail at the sharper turns, but seemed more at ease than during her first journey up the mountain. The morning sun caught the frost on the pine needles, making the forest sparkle. "Town'll be busy today," James said, breaking their comfortable silence. "Sunday service brings folks from all the outlying homesteads." Serafina's fingers twisted in her lap. "Will there be many miners?" "Some," James admitted. "But Pastor Avery keeps good order in his church. No one will bother you there." They reached the valley floor as the church bell began its first calls. Other wagons and riders converged on the wooden church at the town's heart, its white-painted walls bright against the winter-brown grass. James helped Serafina down, conscious of the curious stares from townspeople already gathering near the steps. "Did you see her?" A woman whispered too loudly to her companion. "That's the mail-order bride who barely speaks. My Henry says she's simple-minded." "Hush now," another woman replied. "Poor thing's probably just shy." James felt Serafina tense beside him. He placed a gentle hand at her elbow, guiding her past the whispers and up the church steps. Pastor Avery stood at the door, greeting his flock with genuine warmth. His kind eyes crinkled at the corners when he saw them. "James, good to see you," he said, then turned to Serafina. "And you must be the bride we've been praying for. Welcome to our little congregation." "Thank you, Pastor," Serafina whispered, managing a small smile. "Please come in. We're about to begin." They found seats near the back, where Serafina could observe without feeling too observed. The simple wooden pews filled quickly. James noticed several miners filing in, their good clothes unable to completely hide the coal dust ground into their hands. They sat together near the front, a handful of Garrick's men among them. The service began with a hymn. James opened his hymnal, sharing it with Serafina. As the congregation raised their voices in Rock of Ages, he watched her from the corner of his eye. Her lips moved in perfect time with the words, but no sound emerged. The memory of her brother's cruelty twisted in his gut. That anyone would silence such a gift seemed like a sin itself. Pastor Avery's sermon focused on finding strength in adversity, drawing parallels between the winter season and times of trial in life. But just as spring always follows winter, he concluded, God's grace brings new growth from frozen ground. After the final hymn and benediction, the congregation spilled out into the winter sunshine. James needed to trade his pelts and pick up supplies, so they made their way to the general store. But before they could reach it, a group of townsmen intercepted them. "Halt!" called Marcus Fletcher, who owned the livery stable. "Got a moment?" James nodded politely. "Fletcher." "Been hearing about that offer from the mining company," Fletcher said. "Sounds like good money they're offering for land access." "It's not about the money," James replied evenly. Another man, Peter Walsh from the sawmill, stepped forward. "Think about what it could mean for the town, Holt. Jobs for dozens of families. Regular wages, year-round work. We all know trapping's getting scarcer." "My land's not for sale," James said firmly. "That mountain's been in my family 3 generations. I aim to keep it that way." "You're being stubborn," Fletcher argued. "Progress is coming whether you like it or not. Might as well profit from it." "Man's got a right to his own property," came a new voice. Old Tom Baker, who ran the smithy, had joined the group. "If he doesn't want to sell, that's his business." Several others nodded agreement, including the pastor, who had drifted near enough to hear. The show of support seemed to deflate Fletcher's argument. "Your choice," Fletcher said finally, though his tone suggested he thought it was the wrong one. "Just don't expect much sympathy when—" He caught himself, glancing at the others, and stepped back. "Good day to you." As the group dispersed, Serafina touched James's arm lightly. He looked down to find worry in her eyes. "Let's get those supplies," he said quietly. They were loading the wagon when James noticed Serafina had gone very still, her face pale. Following her gaze, he saw two miners talking near the saloon. Though too far to hear clearly, her expression told him she'd caught something troubling. Once they were headed out of town, she spoke. One of them said Garrick means to handle things the hard way. Her voice quavered slightly. "James, I know my brother. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." "Hey now," James said gently. "Don't borrow trouble. We'll face whatever comes together." But he could see the worry had settled deep in her eyes. She kept glancing back down the valley as they climbed, as though expecting to see riders following. The afternoon light was fading when snowflakes began to fall. Small at first, then thickening steadily. James urged the horses on, knowing they needed to reach the cabin before the storm properly set in. The snow swirled around them, coating the wagon seat and their shoulders in white. It seemed to amplify the tension that had followed them from town, each soft hiss of flakes against leather and wood a whispered warning. Serafina huddled closer as the wind picked up, though whether from cold or fear, James couldn't tell. Probably both. The cabin was just visible through the thickening snow when she spoke again, so quietly he almost missed it. "I'm sorry my being here has brought you trouble." "You've brought nothing of the sort," James said firmly. "Whatever's coming was likely heading my way regardless. At least now I've got something worth standing firm for." She looked up at him then, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes, and for a moment the worry in her face softened into something warmer. Then the wind gusted sharply, making the horses stamp and snort, and the moment passed. They reached the cabin as the storm settled in earnest, the snow now falling in thick curtains that obscured the valley below. James helped Serafina down from the wagon, then hurried to get the horses into the barn. By the time he finished and carried the supplies inside, she had the stove lit and was hanging their snow-dampened coats to dry. The familiar routine of putting away supplies and preparing the evening meal helped ease some of the day's tension, but James could still see concern etched in the set of Serafina's shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the windows, though the snow had hidden everything beyond the glass. The town's pressure and the overheard threat had shaken her hard-won sense of security. Outside, the storm wrapped the cabin in white silence, but it felt less like peace now and more like a holding breath, waiting to see what tomorrow might bring. The morning after their tense return from town, James woke to find Serafina already up, organizing their pantry with careful precision. She had lined up the flour and sugar sacks by size, arranged the dried herbs in neat bundles, and sorted their preserved goods by type. Her quiet industry spoke of someone finding comfort in creating order. "Reckon that's the most organized that Shelf has ever been," James said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, a small smile touching her lips. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to see what we had, make it easier to find things." "Mind? It's a blessing to have someone care enough to do it proper." He pulled on his heavy boots. "Speaking of proper ways, thought I might show you some mountain skills today, if you're willing to learn." Serafina nodded eagerly. After a hearty breakfast of cornmeal mush with dried apples, James brought out 2 pairs of snowshoes. He demonstrated how to secure the leather bindings, then helped Serafina with hers. Her fingers were quick to learn the pattern, though she fumbled a bit with the final knot. "Like this," he guided, showing her again. Has to be snug, but not too tight. Outside, the morning sun sparkled off fresh snow. James led her slowly around the cabin yard, teaching her the slightly rolling gait needed for snowshoeing. Serafina stumbled at first, but soon found her rhythm. Her quiet determination reminded him of a young deer learning its legs, uncertain but persisting. "That's it," he encouraged, as she managed a full circuit without falling. "You're getting the hang of it." They ventured further, James pointing out tracks in the snow: rabbit, fox, deer. He showed her how to read the age of tracks by their edges, how to spot places animals might shelter. When they reached his nearest trapline, he demonstrated how to check and reset the simple snares. "Always remember to thank the creature for its sacrifice," he said softly, as they found a snow hare in one trap. "My ma taught me that. Everything the mountain gives is a gift." Serafina watched intently as he demonstrated how to properly dress the hare. Though the work was bloody, she didn't flinch. Instead, she asked careful questions through gestures and soft words, learning each step. They returned to the cabin as clouds gathered, promising more snow. While James cleaned the hare, Serafina surprised him by taking his worn coat and settling by the fire with needle and thread. Her stitches were tiny, and even as she mended a tear in the sleeve. "Where did you learn to sew like that?" he asked. "At the boarding house," she answered quietly. "Had to earn my keep somehow, when I couldn't." She trailed off, but James understood. When she couldn't use her voice to earn wages, she'd found other ways to be useful. "Well, I'm much obliged," he said. "Been meaning to fix that tear for months." Throughout the afternoon, they worked together in comfortable silence. James showed her how to stretch their meat supplies by smoking some of the hare, while she taught him her trick for making beans more flavorful with dried herbs. As she worked at the stove, something remarkable happened. She began to sing. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper, but the melody was clear and sweet. James found himself standing still, mesmerized by the gentle tune. It wasn't the powerful note she'd used to calm animals, but something more intimate, like a mother's croon to a child. When she noticed him listening, she didn't stop. Instead, her voice grew slightly stronger, filling the cabin with warmth that seemed to reach beyond mere sound. James sat quietly, not wanting to break the spell. When the song ended, the silence felt richer somehow. "That was beautiful," he said simply. Serafina ducked her head, but he could see her pleased smile. "It was my mother's favorite. She used to sing it while cooking." It was the first time she'd mentioned her mother without prompting. James sensed an opening and carefully took it. "What was she like, your ma?" Serafina was quiet for a long moment, stirring the pot of beans. "Kind," she said finally. "She loved to sing, taught me all her songs, said music was God's way of helping us speak when words weren't enough." Her voice grew softer. "She died when I was 12. After that, Garrick, he changed, started drinking. Said my singing reminded him too much of her. That's when he first tried to make me stop." James felt anger rise at the thought of anyone trying to silence such a gift, but he kept his voice gentle. "I'm sorry you lost her so young. Lost your brother, too, in a way." She nodded, wiping quickly at her eyes. "What about your parents? You said they left you the mountain?" "Pa was a trapper like me. Taught me everything I know about the land. Ma was the one who made this cabin a home. Always had something cooking, something growing in her window boxes." He smiled at the memory. "They both took sick one winter, 5 years back. Fever took them within days of each other. Reckon they couldn't bear to be apart." "I'm sorry," Serafina said softly. "Been lonely since," James admitted. But they left me more than just land, left me their stories, their ways, their love for this mountain. They worked together through the evening, sharing more memories between quiet moments. James told her about learning to track with his father, about his mother's famous wild berry pies. Serafina spoke of happy times before her mother's death, singing while hanging laundry, learning to braid bread dough, gathering eggs from their few chickens. After supper, as James banked the fire for the night, Serafina's voice rose again in song. This time it was a lullaby, sweet and low. The melody seemed to wrap around them like a warm blanket. "Used to sing this at the boarding house," she explained softly. "There were always children there, miners' kids mostly. Some had lost their mas, others just needed comfort. This song seemed to ease their fears." James sat at the table, watching her in the candlelight as she continued to sing. Her voice held such gentleness, such healing power. He understood now that her gift wasn't just in those powerful notes that could calm wild things. It was in this too, this ability to soothe troubled hearts and bring peace to worried minds. When the lullaby ended, they sat together at the table, neither speaking for a long moment. The candle flame danced between them, casting warm light on their faces. James saw in Serafina's eyes a quiet joy, a sense of finally being free to be herself. His own heart felt fuller than it had in years. "Thank you," he said simply, "for sharing your gift, for making this cabin feel like home again." Serafina smiled, real and warm. "Thank you for giving me a place where I can sing without fear." The candle flickered, painting hope on both their faces. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin something new was growing. Trust, understanding, and perhaps something deeper still. They sat together a while longer, comfortable in the silence that followed song, while the gentle rhythm of their shared life settled around them like a blessing. Dawn had barely touched the mountain when urgent pounding echoed through the cabin. James rose quickly from his chair by the stove, where he'd been enjoying his morning coffee. Serafina paused in her bread-making, flour dusting her hands as she watched him open the door. Mrs. Killian stood on the porch, her normally tidy gray hair escaping its pins, her face creased with worry. She clutched the reins of her horse, which stood steaming in the cold morning air. "James Holt, I need help," she said, her voice trembling. "It's my little Sarah. She's burning up something fierce, tossing and crying since before sunrise." James nodded gravely. "Come in while we gather supplies." Mrs. Killian stepped inside, wringing her hands. Her eyes fell on Serafina, who had already begun wiping the flour from her fingers. "Oh, Miss Wells, I'm sorry to interrupt your morning." Serafina gave her a gentle smile and gestured for her to sit, but Mrs. Killian remained standing, too anxious to rest. "How long has the fever been building?" James asked, already pulling herbs from his mother's old medicine chest. "Started yesterday evening with just a warm forehead, but this morning—" Mrs. Killian's voice caught. "She's my only grandchild, Mr. Holt, after losing her mother in childbirth." "We'll help," James assured her, packing dried elderberry and willow bark into a leather pouch. He glanced at Serafina, who nodded firmly and was already putting on her warmest shawl. The ride to the Killian homestead took nearly an hour, their horses carefully picking their way through the snowy trail. Mrs. Killian led the way, her mare setting a quick but steady pace. Behind her, James and Serafina shared his sturdy mountain horse, with Serafina holding tight to his waist as they navigated the steep paths. The Killian place sat in a protected valley, smoke rising thin from the chimney. As they approached, a child's cry pierced the morning quiet. Mrs. Killian's shoulders tensed at the sound. Inside the cabin was warm but heavy, with worry. 6-year-old Sarah lay on a small bed near the fireplace, her blonde curls dark with sweat, her face flushed red. She thrashed against the quilts, whimpering. "Grandma," she called out weakly. "It hurts." "I'm here, sweet girl." Mrs. Killian rushed to her side, stroking her forehead. "I've brought help." James immediately set to work, pulling herbs from his pouch and asking for hot water. While Mrs. Killian busied herself at the stove, Serafina moved quietly to the child's bedside. She sat in the wooden chair next to the bed, her presence calm and steady. Sarah's eyes, bright with fever, fixed on Serafina's face. "Who are you?" "This is Miss Wells," Mrs. Killian explained, returning with the heated water. "She's Mr. Holt's." She paused, uncertain how to describe their arrangement. "Friend," James supplied simply, measuring herbs into a cup. "She's here to help." Serafina reached out and took Sarah's small hand in hers. The child's fingers were hot and restless, but they curled trustingly around Serafina's cool ones. Without speaking, Serafina began to hum, so softly at first it might have been the wind. The melody grew clearer, an old hymn about God's tender care. As Serafina's voice gained strength, something remarkable happened. Sarah's restless movements began to still. Her breathing, which had been quick and shallow, deepened and steadied. James paused in his preparation of the herbal tea, watching as Serafina's gentle song filled the cabin. Mrs. Killian stood frozen by the stove, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. The hymn flowed into another, this one about angels watching over sleeping children. Sarah's eyes drifted closed, her grip on Serafina's hand relaxing. Even her flushed face seemed to ease, the pained creases smoothing from her brow. When James brought the medicinal tea, Serafina helped lift Sarah's head, continuing to sing softly between helping her sip the bitter drink. The child didn't protest the taste as children usually did, soothed by the melody that wrapped around her like a cool cloth. Through the morning and into the afternoon, they tended to Sarah together. James applied cool compresses and monitored her fever. Mrs. Killian kept the fire steady and prepared simple broth. And Serafina sat beside the bed, singing whenever Sarah grew restless, her voice a constant comfort. As the sun began its westward slide, Sarah's fever finally broke. Her skin cooled, her sleep deepened, and her breathing grew easy and regular. Mrs. Killian touched her granddaughter's forehead for the 100th time, then burst into fresh tears, these of relief. "I don't know how to thank you both," she said, clasping first James's hand, then Serafina's. "Especially you, Miss Wells. I've never seen anything like it. Your voice, it's a gift from heaven itself." Serafina ducked her head, but James noticed she didn't shrink from the praise as she might have days ago. Instead, a small, grateful smile touched her lips. They stayed until well after sunset, making sure Sarah's improvement held. The child woke briefly, asked for water, and fell into natural sleep, her cheeks now carrying only the faintest flush of lingering fever. "You'll send word if she worsens?" James asked, as they prepared to leave. Mrs. Killian nodded, pulling her shawl tight against the night air. "But I don't think that will be necessary. Whatever that tea was, and whatever blessing Miss Wells carries in her voice, between the two, I reckon my Sarah's going to be just fine." The ride home was slow and peaceful under a bright moon. Their horses' hooves made soft, crunching sounds in the snow, and their breath fogged in the cold air. The stars scattered across the black sky like diamond dust, and the silence felt holy somehow. After a while, James spoke quietly. "What you did today, that was beautiful." Serafina's arms tightened briefly around his waist. "I used to think my voice was a curse. she admitted softly. Garrick made me believe it was something wrong, something to be ashamed of. It's no curse, James said firmly. It's a blessing, pure and simple. I've seen it calm wild things, ease a sick child's suffering. That's God's work, if you ask me. They rode in silence for several moments before Serafina spoke again. When I was young, before Mama died, she used to tell me my voice was a gift meant for healing. I'd forgotten that, these past years, been too afraid to believe it. Your Ma was right, James said. He felt her rest her head against his back, and something in his heart shifted, grew warmer. As they approached their cabin, Serafina began to hum, not the powerful notes that could stop a charging beast, nor the gentle songs that had soothed young Sarah. This was something different, a melody of joy and gratitude that seemed to rise from her very soul. James helped her down from the horse, and in the moonlight he saw her smile, real and bright and unafraid. Something had changed in her today. In using her gift to help another, she'd found a measure of healing herself. They led the horse to the barn together, and as they worked to unsaddle and brush him down, Serafina's humming continued. The horse's ears flicked contentedly, and even the night itself seemed to grow warmer, touched by the quiet music of her newfound confidence. The moon painted everything in silver as they walked from the barn to the cabin. Serafina's steps were light, her head held higher than James had yet seen it. Her gift was no burden to be hidden, but a blessing to be shared. And in accepting that truth, she had begun to bloom like a flower turning toward the sun. The morning sun painted the snow-covered mountain in brilliant white, not a cloud marring the crystal blue December sky. Inside the cabin, warmth from the wood stove wrapped around James and Serafina like a comfortable blanket as they worked together, transforming the simple space for Christmas. James watched as Serafina carefully arranged fresh pine boughs along the windowsill, her fingers gentle as she adjusted each branch. The fresh evergreen scent filled the cabin, mixing with wood smoke and coffee. She had tied red yarn bows to some of the branches, adding spots of cheerful color against the deep green needles. My mama used to say pine boughs keep hope alive through winter, Serafina said softly, smoothing a bow. Her voice, though still quiet, carried more confidence now. She'd decorate every window, even in the leanest years. James smiled, setting down his knife and the paper he'd been carefully cutting into delicate snowflake shapes. My folks did the same. Pa would trek through waist-deep snow sometimes, just to bring Ma fresh greenery for Christmas. Serafina picked up one of his finished paper snowflakes, holding it up to catch the morning light streaming through the window. These are beautiful, James. I never would have guessed such strong hands could make something so delicate. A warm flush crept up his neck at her praise. Reckon even a mountain man can learn to be gentle when it matters. Their eyes met briefly before both looked away, shy smiles tugging at their lips. James returned to his paper cutting while Serafina hung the snowflakes from the ceiling beams with thin twine. Each one spun slowly in the warm air currents, casting shifting shadows on the walls. I have some cranberries saved, Serafina said, reaching for a small cloth bag. We could string them with the pine cones you gathered. She settled at the table across from James, pulling out a needle and thread. As they worked, they talked of simple things, how the morning light painted the snow pink at dawn, which herbs still grew in the sheltered spots near the creek, how the jays squabbled over pine nuts in the trees. But gradually, their conversation turned toward the future. Come spring, James said, carefully threading cranberries. I thought to expand the vegetable patch. Maybe add some flowers, too, if you'd like that. Serafina's fingers stilled on her string of pine cones. Flowers would be nice, she said softly. I used to grow marigolds in tin cans on the boarding house windowsill. Could build you proper flower beds, James offered. Good soil here once the ground thaws. Could even put in a little fence to keep the rabbits out. Her eyes lit up. Perhaps some climbing roses, along the south wall where it's warm? James nodded, his heart warming at her enthusiasm. Anything you want. This is your home now, too. The word home hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Serafina ducked her head, but James caught her pleased smile. When their decorating was done, James made an excuse about checking his tool shed. In truth, he had been working on a special project, a small wooden box with a hinged lid carved with delicate pine branches and tiny birds. He wanted it to be perfect, a Christmas gift worthy of the joy she had brought to his quiet life. He worked on it whenever he could steal a private moment, his knife carefully shaping each detail. The wood was a piece of maple he'd been saving, its grain smooth and golden. As he carved, he thought about how Serafina had transformed his lonely cabin into a true home, with her gentle presence and miraculous voice. Later that afternoon, with the sun high and bright, they decided to take a walk. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they followed the path toward the creek. Serafina wore the warm shawl Mrs. Killian had insisted on giving her after Sarah's recovery, its blue wool bright against the white landscape. They walked in comfortable silence, their breath clouding in the crisp air. When they reached a steeper section of the path, James instinctively offered his hand. Serafina took it without hesitation, her mittened fingers curling trustingly around his. Neither let go when the path leveled out. They reached the creek, its waters running dark and swift between snow-covered banks. A family of chickadees flitted through the branches above, their cheerful calls the only sound besides the running water. Sometimes, Serafina said, her voice barely above a whisper, I wake up afraid this has all been a dream, that I'll open my eyes and be back in that boarding house, hiding from Garrick's men. James squeezed her hand gently. This is real as the mountain itself. You're safe here, free to be exactly who God made you to be. She turned to face him, snowflakes catching in her dark hair. I never thought I'd find a place where my voice would be welcomed as a blessing instead of feared as a curse, where I could just be. The sun was beginning its descent as they made their way back to the cabin, their joined hands swinging gently between them. The temperature dropped with the fading light, painting the western sky in streaks of pink and gold. Inside, James built up the fire while Serafina lit the oil lamps. The cabin glowed warm and golden, paper snowflakes dancing in the lamplight. Without prompting, Serafina began to sing. It wasn't the soft humming she'd done before, nor the careful contained notes she used to calm animals. This was a full hymn, her voice rising clear and strong, filling every corner of the cabin with its beauty. The words spoke of God's faithful love, of hope in dark places, of light that could never be extinguished. James stood perfectly still, afraid to move lest he break the spell of the moment. He'd heard her sing several times now, but never like this, never with such freedom and joy. Her voice held power enough to calm wild beasts, yet here it was gentle as falling snow, warm as summer rain. When the last note faded, James found his own voice. God sent you here, he said simply. I believe that with my whole heart. Serafina's cheeks flushed pink, but she met his gaze steadily. Perhaps he sent me to you, she said softly, but he also sent you to me. I needed a safe harbor, and he led me to this mountain, to this cabin, to you. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken things. Finally, James cleared his throat. Best get supper started. Sun's nearly down." They moved around each other in the small space with practiced ease, preparing a simple meal of cornbread and bean soup. Serafina hummed as she worked, no longer hiding her gift. James found himself smiling as he set the table, his heart fuller than he could ever remember it being. The cabin glowed with warmth and welcome, pine boughs on the windowsills, paper snowflakes dancing above, cranberry strings catching the lamplight. But more than the decorations, it was the presence of shared joy that transformed the space. 2 days before Christmas, and James realized he had already received the greatest gift he could imagine, the trust and affection of this remarkable woman who had found her way to his mountain home. As they sat down to their simple supper, the future stretched before them like fresh snow, clean and bright and full of possibility. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their hearts joined by something stronger than fear, sweeter than silence, and more enduring than the mountain itself. Dawn broke crisp and clear on Christmas Eve morning, painting the snow-covered mountain in shades of rose and gold. James woke early, moving quietly so as not to disturb Serafina behind her curtained sleeping area. He had been planning this special breakfast for days, carefully setting aside the choicest ingredients from their stores. The cabin's main room filled with warmth as he built up the fire and set water to boil. From his secret cache, he pulled out real coffee beans he'd been saving, grinding them by hand in the wooden mill. The rich aroma filled the small space as he prepared the pot. Next came the last precious eggs, carefully preserved in sawdust, and a small portion of salted bacon he'd traded for in town. He heard Serafina stirring just as he was dropping biscuits into the cast-iron skillet. The curtain rustled, and she emerged, her dark hair loosely braided, wearing the blue calico dress she saved for special occasions. "Merry Christmas Eve," James said softly, sliding the skillet into the oven. Her eyes widened at the sight of their humble feast in preparation. "James, you shouldn't have gone to such trouble." "No trouble at all," he replied, though they both knew these ingredients were precious up here in the mountains. "Thought we deserved something special today." Serafina moved to help him, their shoulders brushing as they worked side by side. She set the table with their everyday tin plates, but added sprigs of pine between the settings, making them feel festive. The morning light streamed through frost-painted windows, catching on the paper snowflakes still dancing from the ceiling. When everything was ready, they sat down together. Steam rose from the coffee cups, and the biscuits were golden brown. James had even brought out a small jar of preserved blackberries he'd been saving for a special occasion. "This is wonderful," Serafina said, her voice full of quiet joy. She hesitated, then added, "I have something for you too." She rose and went to her trunk, returning with a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "I wanted to wait until tomorrow, but perhaps now is better." James carefully untied the string and unfolded the paper. Inside lay a hand-knitted scarf in deep forest green, the wool worked in an intricate pattern of cables and knots. He ran his fingers over the careful stitching, recognizing the hours of work that had gone into it. "I noticed your old one was wearing thin," Serafina explained softly. "I've been working on it in the evenings, after you go out to check the animals." "It's perfect," James said, his voice rough with emotion. He wrapped it around his neck, feeling the warmth of both the wool and her care. "Thank you." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, savoring the special breakfast. Outside, a few lazy snowflakes began to fall, adding to the peaceful morning atmosphere. Finally, Serafina spoke. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming all this. A month ago, I was so afraid, always looking over my shoulder. And now? James prompted gently. Now I feel safe, but I worry about bringing danger to your door. If Garrick— Listen to me, James interrupted, reaching across the table to take her hand. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. I may not be your husband yet, but I made a promise to protect you when you stepped off that stage. That promise grows stronger every day. Serafina's fingers tightened around his. I never dared dream of finding someone who would accept me. All of me, including my voice. I was taught it was something to hide, to be ashamed of. Your voice is a gift from God, James said firmly. Anyone who says different is wrong. Plain and simple. They spent the morning working together, completing their daily tasks with an underlying current of joy. James split wood, while Serafina tended to the animals, her clear voice carrying across the yard as she calmed the nervous young mare. The sound made James smile, remembering how she had once been too afraid to sing openly. As afternoon settled in, they began preparing for evening. Serafina mixed dough for a Christmas bread her mother had taught her to make, filling the cabin with the scent of yeast and cinnamon. James brought in extra firewood and checked their supplies, making sure they were prepared for the storm that was building in the western sky. The snow began falling more heavily as dusk approached. James stood in the doorway, watching the white flakes swirl in the gathering darkness. Serafina joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Beautiful, isn't it? She whispered. James turned to look at her, seeing the wonder in her eyes as she watched the snow fall. The moment felt weighted with meaning, and he knew he needed to speak what was in his heart. Serafina, he said softly, turning to face her fully. I know we haven't known each other long, and we're not properly married yet, but I want you to know something. She met his gaze, her eyes steady and trusting. I choose you, he continued, his voice deep with emotion. Here and now, I choose you as my partner in all things. Whatever comes, be it Garrick or mining companies or winter storms, I will stand beside you. I will protect you with my life if need be, not because you're weak, but because you're precious to me. Tears gathered in Serafina's eyes, but she didn't look away. Instead, she stepped closer and rested her head against his chest. James's arms came around her naturally, holding her close as the snow fell beyond the doorway. I trust you, she whispered into the quiet. With my life, with my voice, with my heart, I choose you too. They stood there in the doorway, snow drifting around them, sharing a moment that felt like a sacred vow, more binding than paper, more precious than gold. This was a promise made in perfect truth between two hearts that had found their home in each other. When the cold finally drove them inside, James built up the fire while Serafina lit the oil lamps. The cabin glowed warm and golden, paper snowflakes dancing in the lamplight, pine boughs releasing their fresh scent in the heat. They settled in their usual places by the fire, but something had shifted between them. The simple companionship they had been building over the past weeks had deepened into something more profound. Their quiet conversation flowed naturally, touching on dreams of spring gardens and summer berries, of building a proper barn, and maybe adding a room to the cabin. The fire crackled peacefully, casting warm light across their faces as they sat together, content in their shared hopes for the future. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountain in pristine white, while inside the cabin, two hearts beat in perfect harmony, unaware that danger lurked in the gathering darkness. James watched Serafina as she worked on her knitting, her fingers moving steadily through the familiar motions. The firelight caught the simple silver cross at her throat, the only piece of jewelry she owned, making it gleam softly. He touched the scarf she had made him, still wrapped around his neck, and smiled at how right everything felt in this moment. The evening passed in gentle companionship as they prepared a simple supper together, moving around each other in the small space with practiced ease. They shared cornbread and beans, made special by the addition of dried apple slices Serafina had been saving. Afterward, they sat by the fire again, peace settling around them like a warm blanket. Serafina began to hum softly, the sound mixing with the crack and pop of the fire. James closed his eyes, letting her gentle music wash over him. This was everything he had, never known to want. This quiet partnership, this shared strength, this profound understanding between two souls who had found their way to each other against all odds. The snow fell steadily outside their windows, but inside the cabin, all was warmth and light and hope. Tomorrow would be Christmas, their first together, and the simple joy of that thought filled both their hearts as they sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. The peaceful evening stretched on as snow continued falling outside their cabin windows. James rose from his chair by the fire, adjusting the new scarf Serafina had made him. "Best check on the animals one last time," he said, reaching for his heavy coat. "Make sure they're settled for the night." Serafina nodded, continuing her knitting by lamplight. "Don't stay out too long. The wind's picking up." James stepped out into the swirling snow, pulling his collar tight against the cold. The barn wasn't far, just 30 paces from the cabin door, but the weather made the short walk feel longer. His boots crunched through fresh powder as he made his way across the yard. Inside the barn, the animals shuffled quietly in their stalls. James checked their feed and water, speaking soft words of comfort to each one. The mare nickered softly as he patted her neck. All seemed well, but something made him pause. A faint sound carried on the wind. Voices, he thought, though surely no one would be up the mountain on Christmas Eve. Then he heard it clearly, drunken shouts echoing up the trail. James's heart dropped as multiple lanterns appeared through the falling snow, bobbing and weaving as horses struggled up the path. He counted 5 lights, then 6. The shouting grew louder, slurred with whiskey and spite. "Halt!" a deep voice bellowed. "Get out here!" James recognized Garrick Wells's voice, thick with drink and anger. He hurried from the barn, positioning himself between the approaching men and his cabin. Through the doorway, he could see Serafina frozen in her chair, knitting forgotten in her lap. 6 riders emerged from the snowy darkness, Garrick Wells in the lead. Their horses stamped nervously in the deep snow, steam rising from their flanks. Each man carried a lantern, the flames casting eerie shadows across their faces. "What do you want, Wells?" James kept his voice steady, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Garrick swayed slightly in his saddle, a whiskey bottle clutched in one hand. "Come to make you a final offer on this worthless patch of rock," he spat into the snow. "Mining company's tired of waiting. Sign the papers tonight or we'll make you regret it." "My answer hasn't changed," James said firmly. "This land's not for sale. Now ride back down that mountain before someone gets hurt." Garrick's scarred face twisted into an ugly smile. "Oh, someone's getting hurt tonight, Holt. Just a matter of—" He stopped abruptly, his eyes fixing on something behind. James. James's heart seized as he realized Serafina had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. The lamplight from inside illuminated her face clearly. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Garrick's expression transformed from confusion to disbelief to murderous rage. "Serafina," he whispered, then roared, "Serafina!" She shrank back into the doorway as Garrick threw his whiskey bottle aside and lurched from his horse. "You're supposed to be dead. We searched for weeks after you ran." His voice cracked with fury. "And now I find you here, with him?" James moved to block Garrick's path. "Stay back, Wells. She's under my protection." "Protection?" Garrick laughed harshly. "That's my sister you stole, Holt. My flesh and blood." He turned to his men. "Take him." 2 miners dismounted and rushed forward. James managed to land a solid punch on the first, sending him sprawling, but the second caught him in the ribs. As he struggled, more men joined the fight. Through the chaos, he heard Garrick shouting, "Burn him out! Burn the whole cursed place!" "No!" Seraphina's scream pierced the night as several lanterns arced through the air. Glass shattered against the cabin's log walls. Kerosene splashed and caught, flames licking up the rough-hewn surface. Seraphina darted back inside, emerging moments later with a bucket of water. She threw it at the spreading fire, dousing most of the flames before they could take hold. James fought desperately, but 4 against 1 were impossible odds. Fists and boots found their mark again and again. He tasted blood, felt ribs crack. Still, he struggled to reach Seraphina, to keep his promise of protection. "Stop, please!" Seraphina's voice carried over the sound of fighting. "Garrick, you're killing him!" A final blow caught James behind the ear, and darkness exploded across his vision. He felt himself falling, the snow rising up to meet him. The last thing he heard was Garrick's voice, cold with vengeful promise. "At dawn, sister dear. I'm coming back. We'll settle things proper then. Take this land and take you home where you belong." His boot nudged James's limp form. "If he's still breathing by morning, tell him to thank God I'm feeling charitable on Christmas Eve." Hoofbeats faded into the snowy night. James tried to move, to speak, but his body wouldn't respond. He felt gentle hands on his face, heard Seraphina's quiet sobs as she knelt beside him in the blood-stained snow. "James, please," she whispered, her tears falling onto his cheeks. "Please don't leave me alone." But consciousness slipped away from him like water through cupped hands, leaving only darkness and the sound of Seraphina's terrified weeping. The wind picked up, driving the snow harder against the cabin walls. The yard was a chaos of trampled snow and scattered lantern glass, the signs of violence stark against the pristine white. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled on, unaware that the peace it had witnessed just hours before lay, shattered, in the December night. Seraphina's sobs echoed in the darkness as she cradled James's head in her lap, her worst fears realized. Her brother had found her. James lay grievously hurt, and dawn would bring a reckoning she had prayed would never come. All their Christmas hopes, all their gentle dreams, lay as broken as the lanterns scattered across the bloodied snow. Seraphina's tears mingled with the blood on James's face as she knelt beside him in the trampled snow. The gang's laughter echoed from their camp down the ridge, carrying clearly through the frigid air. She couldn't leave him here to freeze. "James," she whispered, touching his cheek. "I need you to help me, please." No response came from his still form. Seraphina looked at the cabin door, measuring the distance. 20 feet felt like 20 miles, but she had no choice. Threading her arms under his shoulders, she began to drag him through the snow. Her muscles screamed in protest as she inched backward, step by painful step. The rough-hewn doorframe finally met her searching hand. She pulled James over the threshold, his boots scraping against the wooden planks. The firelight revealed the full extent of his injuries, bruises darkening his jaw, blood matting his hair, chest rising and falling in shallow, pained breaths. Seraphina secured the door's heavy wooden bar, though she knew it would do little good if Garrick and his men decided to return before dawn. The familiar fear rose in her throat, threatening to choke her, but she forced it down. James needed her. She dragged him closer to the hearth, where the fire still burned steady and warm. Her hands shook as she gathered clean cloths and the herb box James kept for emergencies. Inside, she found dried yarrow for bleeding, arnica for bruising, and willow bark for pain. The familiar scents steadied her as she heated water in the cooking pot. "I'm here," she murmured, carefully cleaning the blood from his face with a warm cloth. "I won't leave you." Down the ridge, voices rose in anger. The gang's drinking was turning ugly. Through the cabin's thick walls, she could hear Garrick's voice rise above the others. "Come sunrise, we finish this," he slurred. "Finish the man proper, take what's ours." More shouting followed. Arguments about what to do with James's body, how to make it look like an accident. Seraphina's hands stilled as she listened, ice forming in her veins. This was the brother she remembered, not the one who had once carried her on his shoulders, but the one twisted by drink and rage after their parents died. She turned back to James, applying yarrow poultice to the worst cuts. His skin felt cool to her touch. She added more wood to the fire, then covered him with every blanket she could find. Still, he didn't wake. "Please," she whispered, pressing a cold cloth to his forehead. "Please come back to me." The hours crept by like years. Seraphina tended James's wounds, made him swallow willow bark tea a few, drops at a time, and prayed without ceasing. Each time his breathing hitched or slowed, terror gripped her heart. She couldn't lose him. Not now, not like this. Outside, the gang's voices gradually quieted as exhaustion and whiskey took their toll. Only Garrick remained awake, pacing in the snow. She could hear his boots crunching back and forth, like a caged animal waiting to strike. Near midnight, as she changed James's bandages, memories began flooding back. James teaching her to snowshoe, his patience endless as she stumbled. His quiet joy when she first sang freely in their home. The way he looked at her like she was precious, not broken. The gentle strength in his hands as they'd walked through the snow just hours ago, planning their future. "I was so afraid," she whispered, stroking his hair back from his face. "Afraid of everything. The mountain, the town's whispers, my own voice, but you never were. You saw me, really saw me, from that first day." More memories came. James defending her from gossip in town, teaching her to check his trap lines, showing her how to read weather in the clouds. 100 small kindnesses, freely given, asking nothing in return except her trust. Dawn was still hours away, but the moon cast silver light through the cabin's small windows. Seraphina rose and walked to the hearth, where the fire burned low but steady. She added another log, watching the flames catch and grow. "I can't let fear rule me anymore," she said softly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I won't let Garrick destroy another good thing. Not this time." She looked at James's still form, wrapped in blankets before the fire. He had promised to protect her with his life. Now it was her turn to protect him with everything she had, including the voice Garrick had tried so hard to silence. Seraphina knelt beside the hearth, clasping her hands tight. "Lord," she prayed aloud, her voice trembling but clear, "I know this gift comes from you, the same voice Garrick called unnatural. You meant for healing. Give me courage to use it as you intended. Show me how to save the man I love." Love. The word escaped before she could catch it, but she knew it was true. Somewhere between that first day on the stagecoach and this terrible night, love had grown as naturally as spring flowers after winter snow. She rose and walked to the window, watching the moonlit yard where James's blood still stained the snow. 5 hours until dawn. 5 hours to find her courage, to transform fear into strength. 5 hours to become the woman James believed her to be. Seraphina turned back to the fire, her spine straightening with newfound resolve. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled her brother's house in the night. She was a woman who had found her place, her purpose, and her voice. And come sunrise, she would use that voice to save everything she held dear. The fire crackled softly as she began gathering what she would need. Her hands no longer shook as she worked. Outside, Garrick's pacing finally stopped, but Serafina kept moving, driven by determination and faith. When dawn broke over the mountain, she would be ready. She stood at the hearth, one hand resting on the rough stone, the other pressed to her heart where her voice lay waiting. The same voice that had calmed the mule on that first journey up the mountain. The voice that had soothed a sick child and brought peace to their quiet evenings. God's gift, meant for healing, and perhaps, when sunrise came, for salvation. The first pale light of dawn crept over the mountain ridge, painting the snow with ghostly shadows. Garrick and his men burst through the cabin door, dragging James outside despite Serafina's protests. 2 men held James upright, his feet barely touching the ground, while others formed a loose circle around them. "Time to finish this," Garrick growled, pulling a pistol from his coat. His breath clouded the air in angry puffs as he gestured toward the edge of the clearing. "Take him to the drop. Make it look natural." James struggled weakly against his captors, still dazed from his earlier beating. Blood had frozen in his hair, and his face was a map of purple bruises. Yet his eyes sought Serafina's through the cabin window, trying to tell her to stay safe, to run if she could. Instead, Serafina stepped out onto the porch. The rough-hewn boards bit into her bare feet as she moved forward, ignoring the bite of winter air through her thin dress. Steam rose from her skin as she descended the steps into knee-deep snow. "Sister," Garrick snarled, raising the pistol toward her, "get back inside where you belong." But Serafina kept walking, leaving a trail of footprints in the pristine snow. Her breath formed delicate clouds as she opened her mouth and began to sing. The first note rose pure and clear in the dawn air, a single thread of sound that seemed to catch the early sunlight. It was "Amazing Grace," their mother's favorite hymn, but sung as no one had ever heard it before. Each word carried power that spread across the mountain like ripples on still water. The men holding James went rigid, their grip loosening as the sound washed over them. One by one their hands fell away, until James slumped to his knees in the snow, staring at Serafina in wonder. Garrick's pistol wavered, then dropped to his side as his sister's voice filled the clearing. The familiar melody unlocked memories he'd buried beneath years of bitterness. Their mother singing while she worked, their father's deep laugh, Serafina as a child harmonizing with the church choir before fear and drink had poisoned everything. The horses, which had been stamping nervously in the pre-dawn chill, grew still. Their ears pricked forward, heads lowering in perfect peace as Serafina's song continued to rise and fall. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The words floated across the snow like a physical thing, touching each man with gentle fingers. Some removed their hats, others wiped rough hands across their eyes. One by one, rifles and pistols dropped into the snow. Garrick's knees buckled. He fell forward, catching himself with one hand in the snow as the other pressed against his chest like he'd been struck. Tears froze on his cheeks as years of hatred and rage began to crack and fall away. Serafina moved closer, never breaking the song. Each step left a perfect impression in the snow as she approached her brother. The sun crested the ridge behind her, setting her hair aflame with golden light. "That saved a wretch like me." The words seemed to pierce Garrick's heart. He looked up at his sister, really seeing her for the first time in years, not as something to control or silence, but as the miracle she was. I once was lost, but now am found. Seraphina's voice soared higher, carrying all the forgiveness and healing she'd found in her months on the mountain. The sound echoed off distant peaks and returned transformed, as if the whole world sang with her. Was blind, but now I see. As the last note faded into the crystal morning air, Garrick crumpled completely. Great, racking sobs shook his broad shoulders as he knelt in the snow at his sister's feet. "I'm sorry," he choked out between breaths. "God forgive me, Sarah, I'm so sorry." The gang of miners backed away, looking ashamed. One by one, they mounted their horses and rode down the trail, leaving their weapons behind in the snow. They wanted no part of this holy moment between brother and sister. Garrick reached for Seraphina's hand with trembling fingers. "What I did to you. What I became." His voice broke. "I thought I was protecting you, controlling you. But your voice, it was never wrong or unnatural. It was a gift, God's own gift, and I tried to destroy it." Seraphina's bare feet had gone numb in the snow, but she didn't move. She watched her brother's tears fall, each one washing away another layer of the hardened man he'd become, revealing glimpses of the brother she'd once known and loved. "The land is yours," Garrick whispered, his words barely audible. "I'll make sure no one troubles you again." He looked up at James, who had managed to stand. "Take care of her. She deserves—" His voice caught. "She deserves everything I failed to give her." James shivered violently in the snow, his injuries taking their toll. Without a word, Garrick moved to help Seraphina lift him. Together they supported James between them, making slow progress toward the cabin door. The morning sun cast long shadows across their path as their boots crunched through fresh powder. Inside the cabin, warmth from the still-burning hearth embraced them. They settled James carefully into the chair nearest the fire. His face was lined with pain, but his eyes held steady on Seraphina as she gathered supplies to tend his wounds. "Let me help," Garrick said softly, filling a basin with clean snow to melt. His hands, so recently clenched in violence, now moved with gentle purpose. He stoked the fire and hung the kettle to heat while Seraphina began cleaning the worst of James's cuts. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crack of burning wood and James's occasional sharp intake of breath. Garrick stood by the window, watching morning light spread across the mountain. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "After Ma and Pa died, I thought I had to protect you from everything." He turned to face his sister, who paused in her ministrations to listen. "Your voice. It scared me. People would hear it and want to use you, I thought, or fear you, hurt you." He rubbed his scarred jaw. "But I became the very thing I feared. My drinking made it worse. Every time you sang, His words faltered. Seraphina pressed a cool cloth to James's forehead before speaking. "You tried to silence God's gift with your fists," she said quietly. "You made me afraid of my own voice." Garrick's shoulders slumped. "I did. Lord help me, I did." He sank onto a stool, head bowed. "When you disappeared that night, I thought you'd died in the storm. The guilt near drove me mad. I threw myself into work, into drinking, trying to forget." James reached for Seraphina's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. She drew strength from his touch as she faced her brother. "I forgive you," she said, her voice steady. "But I cannot forget." Garrick nodded, accepting this truth. "You shouldn't have to." He stood, squaring his shoulders. "I've done wrong by you, and by others too. There's blood on my hands from more than just tonight." His gaze settled on the distant peaks. "I aim to ride to Fort Collins, turn myself into the army, make what amends I can." "The winter trails are dangerous," Serafina warned, but Garrick shook his head. "No more dangerous than I've been, running from what I've done." He moved to the door, then paused. "Your voice didn't just save James today, little sister. It saved me too. Broke through all the darkness I'd built up inside." His eyes glistened. "It truly is a miracle, just like Ma always said." Garrick gathered his coat and stepped outside. They heard him mounting his horse, the crunch of hooves in snow. Serafina moved to the window, watching as her brother rode slowly down the trail, leaving deep tracks in the pristine white blanket. Each hoofprint marked another step toward redemption, each moment carrying him further from the man he'd been. The morning sun caught the snow in brilliant sparkles, as if marking this moment of healing with nature's own celebration. Inside the cabin, Serafina returned to tending James's wounds, her hands gentle and sure. The long shadow of fear that had haunted her had finally begun to lift, like morning mist burning away in dawn's pure light. 3 days after Christmas, weak winter sunlight filtered through the church windows, casting gentle rays across the wooden pews. James stood at the altar beside Pastor Avery, his bruises fading, but his pride undiminished. Though he still moved carefully, joy brightened his eyes as he watched the church door. The small congregation turned as Serafina entered, wearing a simple blue dress borrowed from Mrs. Killian. Someone had woven pine sprigs into her hair, their fresh scent mingling with the burning candles. Her steps were sure as she walked down the short aisle, a quiet smile playing at her lips. "Never seen her look so peaceful," whispered one of the townswomen who had once gossiped about Serafina's silence. Now they watched with warm approval as she joined James before the altar. Pastor Avery's gentle voice filled the church as he began the ceremony. "We gather today to join these two souls, brought together by God's grace through trials and triumph." James's hand trembled slightly as he took Serafina's, whether from lingering weakness or emotion, none could tell. Their eyes met and held, sharing memories of dark nights transformed by trust and morning light bringing redemption. When it came time for the blessing, Serafina's voice rose clear and pure, filling the church with a melody that brought tears to many eyes. No fear clouded her song now. Only joy and gratitude flowed through each note. James squeezed her hand, his heart full of wonder at her strength. After the final prayers, neighbors crowded around with congratulations and covered dishes. The church basement filled with the warm scents of fresh bread, roasted chicken, and apple pies. Children darted between tables while adults shared stories and laughter. As afternoon light began to fade, James helped Serafina into Mr. Peterson's borrowed wagon. Their neighbors waved farewell, calling out blessings as the horses turned toward the mountain trail. Wrapped in warm blankets against the winter chill, James and Serafina sat close together, watching their breath frost in the crisp air. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they climbed higher, leaving the town behind. Peace settled over them like fresh snow, clean and pure. Their shared trials had forged something precious, a love built on protection, trust, and the courage to let their true selves shine forth. When Serafina leaned her head against James's shoulder, he smiled, knowing they were finally, truly home. The wagon wheels crunched over fresh snow as James and Serafina approached their cabin in the bright afternoon light. The sun's rays sparkled off ice-tipped branches, making the homestead look like it was draped in diamonds. Their simple home stood steady against the winter backdrop, showing only faint scars from the Christmas Eve violence. James helped Serafina down from the wagon, his movements still careful, but growing stronger each day. Together they carried in the wedding gifts from town. Practical items given with genuine warmth: quilts, preserved foods, kitchen tools, and even a few precious books. "Look how the light fills every corner now," Serafina said softly, arranging jars of honey and preserves on their small shelf. The cabin did seem brighter somehow, as if the shadows of fear had been chased away for good. While Serafina found homes for their gifts, James worked outside with steady determination. He replaced the last of the damaged boards near the door, his hammer striking in a rhythm that spoke of renewal rather than repair. The sound of his work mixed with Serafina's gentle humming inside, creating a peaceful melody of home. As evening approached, James finally finished the secret project he'd been carving before Christmas, a small wooden bird with wings spread wide in flight. He'd worked on it whenever Serafina wasn't looking, wanting it to be perfect. The fine details had taken extra time with his healing hands, but that only made the gift more meaningful. After supper, as lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls, James presented the carving to his bride. "I started this before everything happened," he explained, placing it in her hands. "Seems right to finish it now. A free bird for my songbird." Serafina traced the uplifted wings with gentle fingers, tears gathering in her eyes. The wooden bird seemed almost alive in the flickering light, ready to soar without fear or restraint. Just like her voice now. "It's beautiful," she whispered, then smiled. "Would you like your gift now?" James settled into his chair by the fire, and Serafina began to sing. Her lullaby filled their home with peace, not just the simple notes, but the deep assurance that came from being truly known and loved. The melody wrapped around them like a warm blanket, healing the last hidden wounds in both their hearts. When the song faded into comfortable silence, James stood and offered his hand. "Come see our mountain in the starlight?" They stepped outside together, breaths frosting in the crystal-clear night. The snow-covered peaks stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky, wild and beautiful. But now the vastness felt like possibility rather than loneliness. Serafina's voice rose again, pure and strong, singing an old hymn of gratitude. The notes carried across the silent landscape, blessing everything they touched. James wrapped an arm around her shoulders, marveling at how her gift, once hidden in fear, had become their salvation. The very thing Garrick had tried to silence had turned violence into peace. The voice that once drew scorn now drew people together in wonder. What others had called strange, James knew as miracle. Standing there in the starlight, they were no longer a lonely mountain man and a frightened songstress, but two souls bound together by trust, courage, and love. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.